Hello, my YouTube channel. You find me on my walk home from work tonight, and it's going to be a bit of a different kind of a video. I wanted to do a bit more of a ramble about comics, and it's going to be into my phone because I'm overstimulated about it, and I just can't wait till I get home and sit in front of a nice proper microphone. I often refer to this channel as a reviews channel, and that's not strictly true, because I do other kinds of videos where I talk about series in general and what I want to read and the history of me reading things and stuff. And man, am I on a comic book tear, and I just want to ramble about comics and my appreciation of them and so on and so forth. I don't know what's been happening to me over these last few months, because I've steadily been enjoying comics more the older I get, but these last few months I've really kind of gone into overdrive with it, and I'm borderline obsessed. So I kind of want to tell you where this love of comics comes from, give some context behind this ever-mounting obsession of mine. And I think it begins when I was a kid. It began with a cartoon version of Batman called The Batman. It was the second Batman animated show, not the original famous one. And it began with this weird 3D CGI animated Spider-Man show called Ultimate Spider-Man, which had nothing to do with the comic line. And it was on a weird TV channel in the UK called Jetix. Anyone remember Jetix? I guess I should also point to Danny Phantom. There was a cartoon called Danny Phantom about a kid who could turn into a ghost version of himself. And obviously that was modelled pretty heavily on superhero comics, and I loved that shit growing up. And then as I hit my teenage years, there were the Christopher Nolan Batman movies, there were also the Spider-Man movies. I guess this is a very mainstream pop culture entry into comics, as I imagine most modern comics readers do begin with. But I think quite atypically, I didn't really get into comics themselves until I was an adult. I guess quite a fresh adult, but an adult nonetheless. And the more I learn about comics in the early 2000s, the more I wonder if maybe that's just a symptom of where Marvel and DC were at the time. Also it wasn't in my family. My parents never read comics. We didn't go to my local comic book shop ever at all. I was big into reading as a kid, but that was all like Jiggy McHugh and, oh my god, whatever the hell else I read. If we're going back to the really, really young years, I guess stuff like Horrid Henry, like kids' books. But then as I got older, like the saga of Darren Shan and Alex Rider and all that stuff. But I'm trying to remember what came first. I think it honestly might have been when I was 19 or 20, sometime when I was at uni, I think. I just started to get curious about source material, and I don't actually remember the decision that led to me checking out, but for whatever reason I decided to check out Amazing Spider-Man. And because I knew nothing about comics or how they worked, I do vaguely remember being a little bit flummoxed as to wait, hang on a minute, how do I get Spider-Man as I recognize it? How do I get Spider-Man where it's Peter Parker and Harry Osborn, who becomes the Green Goblin after his dad, and Mary Jane Parker's his girlfriend. I don't recognize most of these characters. Who's Betty Brant? Who's Gwen Stacy? Why is Aunt May 1,000 years old? But yes, what I'm getting at here is I read the first, I think it was 150 issues of Amazing Spider-Man from the 1960s. I eventually just decided it's confusing trying to figure out where to start, or the idea of starting somewhere and not knowing everything that came before it was completely alien to me. Sod it. I'll just read from the beginning, which I would recommend if you're curious about the origins of the Marvel Universe and comics in the 60s. I would not recommend if you're a new reader looking to get into comics. But tonight I've been thinking about that and how much I appreciate it, because I've just discovered, I've been watching a lot of comic book YouTube recently, and I've just discovered a channel. I'm afraid I don't remember the name. I might insert it in editing here. But there's a guy who, because most comic book YouTubers, they focus on stuff from the 80s onwards, which is probably when, modern era comics really began, like Bronze Age to Modern Age, and we really started to get more grounded storytelling and more intricate storylines. And I can see why people focus on that stuff. It's what I focus on, to be fair. But I've discovered this channel where this guy collects Marvel Epic editions and DC Finest collections, and those mostly focus on Golden and Silver Age stories, and his love for them is infectious, and it's really made me reconsider my earliest years reading Amazing Spider-Man issue 1 onwards, and how fond I was. I wasn't sat there going, it's all old and weird and I don't like it. I was sat there going, this shit's old and it's awesome. However, I did eventually pick up New 52 Batman, followed later by New 52 Superman, New 52 Justice League, and New 52 The Flash. If you've seen my bookshelf tour, you already know this. You know how I feel about each of those titles. They are mostly amazing. The Flash, not so much. That was after I watched the Flash CW show season 1 as well, and I really wanted it to be like the show, and it's really not. In fact, I've yet to look up and see if any Flash run is like the show at all, because I would be interested in that. Oh, probably before then as well, I picked up Alternate Spider-Man Ultimate Collection Volume 1, which is, I want to say a deluxe trade paperback size. I think it's like 300, 400 pages, and it begins that as well. And then what happened is I discovered Marvel Unlimited, and I read pretty much exclusively digital comics, especially after I got myself a tablet, which was trade paperback size. And, you know, there are people who say digital comics aren't great. I swear by them still. Paperbacks are obviously going to be superior reading experience, but they are fantastic. Especially if you're on a budget and you can't afford to be throwing, you know, months and months worth of money at these, you know, decades worth history of paperback books, just to brush yourself up on that kind of history. This is a really good way of doing it, and I highly recommend it to anyone just getting into comics. Sorry, I don't know why I'm quite so out of breath. It's not usually this bad. I actually record while walking home quite often, just on a different kind of a project, and it's not normally this bad. But yeah, not too long after I discovered Marvel Unlimited and read a bunch of Amazing Spider-Man, by the way, and a bunch of Spider-Man 2099 I loved, and a bunch of Daredevil. I loved the Brian Michael Bendis run of Daredevil. Then after that, DC Universe Infinite, and I've been reading a ton of stuff there. I read through a lot of New 52 stuff, usually continuing onwards from the paperbacks I owned. That was so long ago I hardly remember any of it, so I'd be down for a reread at some point. But I also read a bunch of Silver Age Flash comics. More recently I've been reading a bunch of Rebirth era stuff. Nightwing by Tom Taylor was my last real, like, just read all of it back to back and love it. I made a video about that already. That's a bit later than Rebirth era, but I read Rebirth era leading up to that, you know what I mean? I think I accidentally skipped the Rick Grayson stuff, for which I am told I am lucky that I have done so. Oh, and I completely forgot to mention, when I was in my early 20s and I didn't really know much about comics, and I was still pretty new to the whole disposable income thing, I subscribed to a thing called The Legend of Batman by a now defunct company called Eagle Moss Collections. And so I own many physical volumes, trade paperback volumes, or trade hardback volumes, I should say, of Batman, which I've yet to read most of, but I am currently doing a project on this channel where I read through them and review them as I go, and so far it's been a brilliant time. And then most recently, I've discovered the DC Compact Collection, or DC Compact Comics Collection, and the Marvel Premiere Edition collection, which is sadly a little bit less active, but I've used those to kind of like dip my toe back into physical comics, and yeah, I think there's going to be more physical comics in my future, because I've also discovered the existence of these epic collections and these DC Finest volumes, which, for those of you who aren't aware, are some pretty chunky paperback volumes, which are usually 400, 500, 600 pages, and collect like years worth kind of things. Like, that's how Finest does it anyway. They do like 77 to 79 like every freaking like Superman comic, so not just like the Superman line, but the Action Comics line and whatever else they had going on at that time. And you know, it would cost a lot of money, and it would be a grand undertaking to try and collect every single one of those books, but I could see myself picking up a few of them, especially some of like the volume ones if I can find them in print at some point, because I really want some of that Amazing Spider-Man stuff physically, and I'd be really happy to own some super early years of Batman, Superman and The Flash as well. And honestly, that's pretty much where I'm at right now. You know, I'm this guy who dipped into comics digitally, started buying them physically, realized how expensive that was happy to live a digital life, digital subscription life, and then has recently rediscovered the love of physical books, and now I'm kind of assessing, like, what do I want to read as part of a subscription, and what do I want to own physically? And honestly, that's a really interesting conversation I'm having in my head. Obviously, it is very restricted by my own personal budget. I am not a rich man, but you know, just as kind of like a, you know, side hobby kind of thing, every now and again picking up one of these books, what are the kinds of books I would like to focus on. And honestly, that budgetary limitation is part of the intrigue. It's why I love the compact comics so much, like knowing I'm not going to be able to have a bookshelf of like volume 1 all the way up to volume whatever and have like this comprehensive collection, which honestly I feel like I wouldn't even need, because if I'm going to do that, if I'm going to be an encyclopedia reader, I might as well just do it through Marvel Unlimited, because I do enjoy reading digital comics. It's its own kind of comfy experience. So yeah, I'm still kind of figuring out, what do I want physically? What am I happy reading digitally on a subscription? And there's also the idea of like, you know, Marvel Unlimited might not exist a decade from now, but also am I happy like reading something I really enjoy digitally to the point where I want to own it physically for a future reread, or just to have it? And I think that's where I'm at with a lot of the Absolute and Ultimate Universe stuff that Marvel and DC are doing right now. And, you know, as I'm talking, I am a little bit aware that I'm kind of saying things that I've already said in content in other places, but I just realized that I've never spoken this stuff on a channel where I actually talk about comics all the time. So hopefully this doesn't sound too regurgitatory, if you follow me in other places. But yeah, it's funny, right? Because oh god, there's two avenues that I want to talk about. We'll go Fifth Avenue first. As I've already mentioned, I wouldn't say I'm new to comics, but I am kind of new to comics. You know, I didn't grow up with them as a kid, and I feel like in my exploration of comics as an adult, I very much focused on just a few characters or runs. And it's like the A-list characters, right? It's Batman and Superman and Spider-Man and all that stuff, Daredevil. And the problem with that is there's so much of it. There is so much good Batman, Superman, Daredevil, The Flash content out there that I have still yet to lay my eyes on. Of course, the night when I decide to record audio for a video, everyone on their super loud motorbike is out roaming the streets tonight. That's fantastic. So the question is, do I continue exploring this back catalogue of titles for these characters that I already know I love? Or do I explore more laterally and explore other characters? I'm trying to read more Wonder Woman, for example. I hear she's got some amazing stuff in the modern era, for example. But even she's an A-list character, you know? Like, you know, I tried to read some New 52 Batgirl. That wasn't really my thing. I've really enjoyed reading Nightwing, but I would say they're not even B-tier characters. Like, what's going on with Moon Knight? What's going on with Blue Beetle? What's going on with Blade? You know, I was just thinking about Blade today. I'd like to read some Blade. There are dozens and dozens of these characters who have had their own decades worth of comic book history, maybe to varying results, but like, stuff that I know, there's going to be something in there. There is going to be a gem that I am obsessed with, that just hits all the right notes for me, and that isn't necessarily a mainstream title that I'm reading. Because even this Legend of Batman series that I'm doing, this back catalogue read-through series of on the channel, right? That all collects the most iconic Batman stories, and I find myself every week just being like, wow, this is such an iconic story, wow, it's such a banger, and I'm finding very little bad to say about them, because it's all just the highlights. And yet there's still 80 volumes of the fucking highlights. So when do I find the time to go and read Ghost Rider or some shit? There are still so many A-list characters that I'm really curious about exploring, like, decades worth of stories about. I've just started on 4 for the first time, and I've started with the 1999 run, I want to say, by Dan Jurgens, and I'm only like 11 issues into it so far, and it's fine, but that's the thing. I'm cool with reading comics that are just fine, because if I just read iconic stories all the time, I'm going to lose my, my scope. I'm going to lose the context. I'm going to lose, the freaking temperature of the room, because I'm just going to be immersed in the best. And the other side of it as well is like, sure, maybe Dan Jurgens 4 isn't the most iconic 4 out there. Maybe it's not the best story ever told. It's still fun, but also it's still part of a character's lore going forwards, and I know there's callbacks to it later on, from what I've heard people talk about. And again, I don't need to be this encyclopedia reader. I don't need to read everything that's ever been written, but it would be cool to see some of it with my own eyes instead of only sticking to the more modern stuff. And that's me saying 1999 isn't more modern when these comics have been going since the 60s. And that's just Marvel and DC comics. That's the other thing I wanted to talk about. I mentioned this in the weekly waypoint on my main channel, so apologies if I'm regurgitating it here, but I want to start straying away from just Marvel and DC comics being the only bloody comics I ever read, right? And so I've picked up a global comics subscription, which includes firstly, hilariously, a lot of DC and Marvel titles, but also a lot of Image comics and a lot of Dark Horse comics and a lot of IDW comics. And the only real big comics publisher that I don't see on there outside of DC and Marvel is Titan Comics. Would like to see some Titan Comics on there, especially because they do Doctor Who, which actually, now that I mention it, I did pick up the 12th Doctor Volume 1 on sale for £3, and I'm halfway through it, and it's actually really fucking good. I kind of wish I'd bought the entire Year 1 deluxe book instead. But anyway, back to this global comics thing. This is very much like Marvel and DC, Andy's first non-Marvel and DC comic, I know. But I'm currently reading through Invincible, and I'm about 8 volumes in, and it's just chef's kiss. It's goddamn fantastic. And I'll say this much: it doesn't even read like a comic from the early 2000s. It doesn't even look like a comic from the early 2000s. It feels like it would have come out today. And I know the early 2000s weren't that long ago, but I've read enough early 2000s comics to tell you they have a certain flavour to them that modern comics don't. An aroma of edginess with just a hint of desperation. But there is so much else on a global comic subscription that I want to read, and I'm going to read. Not just the heavy-hitting Image Comics titles, but like some more niche stuff, some more like limited run, like someone had an artistic vision for a story and it went on for like 3 volumes and it's incredible. And I can just go check that out. And I traded in my DC subscription for that because I have so much physical DC to read right now. And so yeah, I think that's pretty much where I'm at with comics right now, just looking at this absolute embarrassment of riches, of decades of incredible stories that lie ahead of me to explore, and just like, just feeling overwhelmed a little bit, but in a happy way. Realistically, I do know the answer to some of my dilemma regarding Marvel and DC, and that's that some of that encyclopedia reader instinct from back when I was first checking out comics is still alive within me. And the thing to do is not read every single Thor comic and every single, Captain America comic and every single Iron Man comic and every single Avengers comic and every single X-Men comic. The thing to do is to look up either good suggested starting reading points or just like the most iconic stories from each, and just read those. And it doesn't matter if you don't know all the backstory or if you're not reading it all in chronological order, because in the future I might reread it with more context. I might reread it as part of like reading a run instead of just like these selected volumes. And something I'm going to appreciate more and more with Marvel and DC is that part of loving these comics is loving learning about the lore. Like, there is so much lore, and you don't learn all about it from just reading the comics. You learn about it from watching videos of people having recommendations, and you learn about it from, someone just mentioning something offhandedly to you about, oh, it seems like they're adapting this in the MCU, and that comes from this. And it's like, wait a minute, what do you mean that the Hulk found out that his powers didn't come from gamma radiation? I have no idea what that's about, by the way. But apparently, like, they redo his origin, and it turns out to be more supernatural or something, which sounds really interesting. I am not a Hulk fan. I don't really give a shit about the Hulk, but apparently the Hulk in comics is incredible. That's not meant to be a pun. I know it's the Incredible Hulk, but you know what I mean. So yeah, when the hell do I start checking out Hulk comics? It's like, come on, man, I want to read Saga. I want to see what Fables are about. I want to see what East of West has going on. I want to read whatever that... Oh, do I even remember what it's called? At some point, I want to read, like, Judge Dredd and, like, Spawn and some of those, like, really popular 90s comics. And then I also want to read, like, there's something called Witchblade, which sounds interesting. There's all these other titles, and it's like, when the hell am I going to get to them, man? And then I remember I've got my... Touchwood, entire life ahead of me. I mean, we've all got our entire lives ahead of us. That's how it goes, right? Not to get too funny. If he's watching this, I hope he doesn't take this the wrong way. I doubt he's watching this, but you never know what happens when you mention another creator. But that guy I mentioned who talks about Silver Age comics and Golden Age comics and stuff, he's in his 50s, and I feel like so comfortable or so comforted by the fact that this man is in his 50s and he's still talking about comics which excite him, and he's still discovering new comic stories which excite him and stuff, because it reminds me I've still got, hopefully, so many years ahead of me of that stuff myself. And at least for the foreseeable future, I intend to explore those books on this channel with you. If you're still here, if you've enjoyed my rambling and my huffing and my puffing, alongside, of course, many fantasy books, many science fiction and fantasy books that I want to read, and maybe some horror and some thriller as well. And then, of course, there's shows and movies, and there's so much media, there's so many stories. We live in an absolute embarrassment of riches. And dear viewer, it is my hope that we will navigate those waters together. I'm going to stop rambling, and I'm going to call it a night, because I'm almost home. So thanks for checking this out. Let me know if you have any recommendations for me, or any directions you think I should be pursuing. You might have already picked up on the fact that I am reading multiple things at once. I'm happy to do that, as long as it's not too crazy. I have no idea when this video is going to go out, because I don't want to clump videos too closely together. But it is Halloween. Very early morning Halloween as I'm recording this, so I'm going to go read Deceased, because that seems, if not spooky, then at the very least horrific, which seems to fit the mood. So I'm going to go do that, and I'll tell you all about it. Thanks.